Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for being with us today. My name is Mamadou Abbas Diop, and I'm a senior analyst with the Global ACAPS Global Analysis team at ACAPS. And it's a real pleasure to be facilitating today's discussion, particularly on World Humanitarian Day, which feels like a very fitting moment to reflect on the challenges surrounding humanitarian access. So over the next 75 minutes, we'll take a look at the latest edition of our Global Humanitarian Access Overview, published earlier this month. And we'll then turn to our panelists who will reflect on some of the key findings and share their perspectives on how organizations are navigating these challenges across a range of different contexts. So just a few practical notes before we get started. The session will be recorded, and during the presentation, we kindly ask that you keep your microphones muted. Following the presentation, we'll move into a panel discussion, and then we'll open the floor for questions from the audience. And in the meantime, feel free to use the chat function to share any questions as they come to mind, and we'll keep an eye on those and make sure to pick them up throughout the session. Now, just to introduce you to our panel today, we are very pleased to be joined by two excellent panelists who bring complementary perspectives to this conversation. First, we have Anthony Neal, who's the Director of Policy, Advocacy and Communications at INSO, the International NGO Safety Organization. Anthony brings a strong field and coordination perspective, helping us understand how access constraints affect NGO operations on a day-to-day basis, and what happens to collective safety and coordination when those constraints come under pressure. We are also joined by John Novakovic, who is the Executive Director of GISF, the Global Interagency Security Forum, a network of NGOs working on security risk management. John brings the organizational and security risk management perspective, looking at what these pressures mean for how agencies assess and manage risks, while also meeting their duty of care to staff. So it's a real pleasure to have you both with us today. Just to give you a sense of how we will structure the session, I'll be taking you through the key findings from the report. We then turn to Anthony and John for their initial reflections before we go into the discussion. And from there, we'll open the floor to your questions. So keep them coming through as we go. And yeah, we'll pick them up throughout the discussion and leave space for exchanges by the end of the session. And after that, of course, we will bring that session to a close with a few final reflections from the discussion. So first, let me introduce you to the product we're looking at. The Global Humanitarian Access Overview is our twice-yearly snapshot of the state of humanitarian access across crisis-affected countries. And this edition covers 66 countries, looking at the 6 months period from December to May, December 2025 to May 2026. So just to say a quick word on how it's produced, we start with a systematic data collection exercise across all the crises we monitor. And for each crisis, our analysts review the available evidence over the 6-month period and assess whether specific access constraints are present. And we do this for all crises that are included in the Informed Severity Index. Then these assessments are brought together into a 0 to 5 scale, which gives each country an overall picture of the level of humanitarian access constraints. And the analysis itself is structured around 9 indicators grouped into 3 pillars. So the first looks at people's access to humanitarian assistance. The second pillar looks at humanitarian organizations' access to people in need. And the third pillar captures the physical, environmental, and security constraints that affect both. So for anyone interested in detail, the full methodology is available on our website. And I think Evans has already shared the report and the methodology on the chat function. So please go and explore it if you're interested, because you'll find also more detail on the indicators, the definitions, and the scoring model. So what does the global picture look like? The headline finding is that across 44 of the 66 countries we assessed, people affected by crisis face high to extreme humanitarian access constraints, and 12 of these countries are experiencing constraints that are at the very top of the scale, which is the extreme level. And at these levels, access is severely compromised because humanitarian organizations face major difficulties reaching people in need, while people affected by crisis may also face significant barriers in accessing humanitarian assistance. There is an important caveat to keep in mind, though, when looking at this picture and how it has changed over time, because the set of countries we assessed has shifted in this cycle, and in some cases, improvements in the availability of data has led to higher scores. But even with that caveat, the overall direction is quite clear that humanitarian access constraints are worsening globally. Now, if we look a bit closer on at the regional dynamics, the global picture looks quite different depending on where you are. So rather than going through all 9 regions that we covered in the report, I'll just highlight a few of the patterns that stood out. We can start with the Middle East, where we saw that it's the highest concentration of countries experiencing extreme levels of humanitarian access constraints. And in this region, 4 of the 6 countries that we analyzed are at the very top of the scale. If we look at the Mediterranean, we see that it presents a very different picture, in the sense that here the main constraints are more about administrative and policy barriers faced by refugees and migrants, and also organizations that are present in those countries. In Latin America and the Caribbean, a major factor is territorial control by armed groups and criminal groups who often determine whether humanitarian organizations can operate. In Southern Africa, environmental constraints play a more prominent role. And Myanmar, for example, stands out within Southeast Asia for the scale and nature of its access challenges. So while the overall picture is one of significant and in many places worsening constraints, the nature of these constraints varies a lot from one context to another. And that matters when we think about how humanitarian organizations can respond. Now, let's look for a moment at those 12 countries at the extreme end of the scale, because there's been some significant movements here. 4 countries moved into the extreme category in this cycle, namely Afghanistan, Iran, Lebanon, and Mali. And in what we observed is that in each of these cases, the deterioration was linked to escalating conflict, whether through the US-Iran conflict, the escalation in Lebanon, or the increasing pressure in some of the main cities in Mali, or even like the Pakistan and Afghanistan conflict. But there is one important point to keep in mind when looking at these countries. It's the fact that an extreme score reflects the severity of constraints in the worst affected part of the country. So it doesn't mean that the entire country is uniformly inaccessible, but it does tell us that somewhere in that country, humanitarian access is pushed to the point where reaching people in need is becoming extremely difficult, and in some areas close to impossible. Now, let's if we move a bit more into the other findings of this report, I think one of the clearest is that humanitarian access is increasingly being constrained not only by insecurity, but also through laws, policies and administrative decisions. So where access was once restricted through mainly force or insecurity, we are increasingly seeing governments and authorities restricted through policy and administrative measures. This constraint may be less visible than violence at a checkpoint or an active frontline, but they can be just as consequential as the others. And we see this pattern in three main ways. First, through deregistration and suspension, with organizations being struck off or suspended, effectively cutting off parts of the response at the source. Second, through prosecution and detention, with humanitarian workers being detained, charged, or even criminalized for carrying out their work. And third, restrictions targeting refugees and migrants with access to assistance and protection increasingly limited for people on the move. Now, just to give a few examples, we saw in Niger, for example, that thousands of organizations and associations were deregistered or suspended during the reporting period, and many of those were local civil society organizations. If we look at the prosecution and detention side of things in Yemen, there were at least 73 UN staff that were detained with cases referred to a criminal court. So here we're not just talking about humanitarian workers being unable to reach people in need. We're seeing humanitarian personnel themselves being detained with the machinery of justice, of the justice system being used against people carrying out humanitarian work. And about the restrictions affecting refugees and migrants, we observed that in Egypt, thousands of refugees and asylum seekers were arrested, and across the Maghreb, thousands more were expelled towards desert borders, and we have like many more of these examples throughout the reports. So I think they just illustrate how access constraints can operate far beyond the traditional picture of insecurity or active conflicts. So this is like the broad overview of this over 30-page report that I tried to summarize very briefly. And this is where I will turn to the panelists to get your broader reaction to what I've just presented. Anthony, perhaps I can start with you from INSO's perspective and your view of what's happening across the field. How does this overall picture compare with what you're seeing in the context where you work? And are there any findings that particularly resonates with you or perhaps surprise you?
Thanks, Abbas. No, I think as a starting point, what ACAPS has presented in what is a very, very good report very much aligns with, I think, what we're seeing in general across INSO's countries of operations, that effectively things are not getting better, and where even things were very, very bad before, they continue to deteriorate to a point where, is the scale useful anymore? And I think for me, there's a couple of things that really stood out from this that really kind of aligns with what we're seeing in some of our contexts. The first is, as you were just rightly stating, access is moving beyond kind of security incidents in a traditional sense of the word. So risk to NGO operations are now very much influenced not just by physical risks, but also by the legal, administrative, and political risks that are present in many of the contexts. I don't think this is necessarily a new phenomenon. I think, if I remember correctly, but Abbas, you'll correct me, I think bureaucratic and administrative impediments was the focus of last year's access report. Obviously, I think it was in 2021, 2022, the Interagency Standing Committee developed its guidance on bureaucratic and administrative impediments. And even from our own data, what we saw in 2020, between 2022 and 2024, was a threefold increase in the suspensions of NGOs compared to the 3 years previous to that. But I think, as your numbers rightly outline, what we've seen this year is a massive spike in a number of contexts, particularly Palestine, with the introduction of the new registration requirements and the efforts to push back on sharing the names of staff in the Gaza context, as well as also the dynamics in the Sahel as well. And so I think it's important that we reflect on that in terms of also how we manage risk as an aid sector. One of the other points I think that really comes out and also links a little bit to some of the research that we've also published today around kind of the arrest and detention of aid workers is how detention is now becoming part of this infrastructure through which states seek to control how aid is delivered. You mentioned there kind of contexts like Yemen, but what we see is across multiple contexts, detention is used as a means of administrative enforcement. In fact, when we looked through all of the data that we had for the last kind of 5.5 years on the arrest and detention of aid workers, we found that basically administrative enforcement or detention related to people apparently not having the right visas, people apparently not having the right movement permissions, people not necessarily, or kind of disputes around the right MOUs, etc., were also becoming a way in which states justify detentions. And so what we're seeing is both the bureaucratic and administrative impediments create a framework through which detentions take place or increase the risk of detentions taking place of aid workers, but also that detention is used as that coercive tool to also then enforce the administrative impediments that they are putting forward. I think this reflects also on a shrinking space, not just for the humanitarian sector, but for the wider civil society sector. But I think this is something that we often maybe miss in many pieces of our analysis is when we are feeling under attack and we're feeling constrained, many other civil society actors are also feeling that pressure even more. And I think there's maybe a need as the humanitarian sector to really look at how do we learn from those people who have gone through this before to some extent. You know, I'm thinking here human rights organizations, journalists who, you know, have experienced exactly what we are experiencing now and was highlighted in your report, where the space for us to operate is being intentionally constrained and the whole arsenal of tools that a state has at its disposal are being leveraged against us. How do we then change in terms of our operational setup and to navigate this new landscape? And maybe a final point that I'll end on is I think we also need to appreciate that not all of these access constraints are kind of felt or fall evenly within our own organizations. I think one of the challenges that we see, particularly within this kind of intersection or nexus between administrative impediments and detentions, is that effectively the framework for which we want to operate, you know, the framework that facilitates or is intended or kind of written out to facilitate aid is actually then weaponized against us as aid actors. And obviously, if you're a national of the country in which you're operating in, that has a far greater exposure to risk than an international who may, you know, be on a 2-year rotation and then will eventually leave. And I think this is an important part in terms of, you know, how we look at duty of care, which I'm sure John will touch upon in some of his later answers, because the legal risk that we are potentially creating for our own staff don't necessarily end when we leave as organizations or when their contract comes up. And as this kind of, again, as we see more and more this intersection between legal risk and then the physical risk of detention, I think this is going to become an increasingly pertinent issue as we move forward. I said that was the final point. I'm going to make one more point, if you will allow me, because I really appreciated the inclusion of some of the crisis contexts in the Mediterranean within this report, because I think it's also important as we see more states make commitments to the protection of aid workers and make commitments that they will address the criminalization of aid. We shouldn't forget that in many of the countries where we are headquartered, we also see a criminalization of aid as it pertains to support to migrants and refugee populations. And I think we need to have, more focus on addressing not just criminalization in the Sudan or in Myanmar, but also the criminalization that we're seeing in Greece and Italy and elsewhere in Europe. And so I really do appreciate that ACAPS, made sure to include not just the access constraints that we see, in what we might, from a Western perspective, see as humanitarian context, but also, look at the criminalization a little bit closer to home. Thanks.
Thank you, Anthony, and thanks for the feedback. It's highly appreciated. And yeah, it is true that this shift into access constraints being more driven by law and administrative measures is not new, but it's clearly becoming a defining feature of the humanitarian access landscape across the globe. Thanks for that. I'll hand over to John. John, if you would like to come in from security risk management point of view, how does this land with you?
Thanks, Abbas. And I'll echo Anthony's statement that it's a great report, very useful, very sobering reading. Not a surprise, unfortunately, but it's good to see it captured in such a structured way. It allows a bit of action to come out of that. I'll keep these comments, these reflection comments brief, and maybe we can go into more detail later. Just for a bit of context, so my organization, GISF, is a membership organization, an NGO network with 158 INGO members, and Red Cross, Red Crescent, about 8 of those societies as well. I'll build off Anthony's point about the cross-learning. I think about 70% of our members are humanitarian development, but the remainder are rights-based organizations, Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, Transparency International, et cetera. And he's right to point that out, because we are seeing a lot more convergence of these discussions where the aid organizations are coming and saying to the rights-based ones, right, we haven't actually dealt with this before. Like, can you teach us? And we see that, and you can even see that for a long time in the digital space, and let's not forget, that's an interesting element here, is the access and the constraints around the digital space as well. Rights-based organizations are a lot further ahead on that than aid organizations, and there's a lot to learn. So definitely echo that from Anthony. Overall, looking at the report, I think it's interesting to see that the access challenges are starting to come from these new directions, or the uptick is new. The directions are many generations old, but if we think about these, so the administrative and political impediments, also the changes in levels of funding, and also the nature of the funding, which feeds some of these impediments as well, and also makes them harder to navigate. Even the new elements such as drones, which are now starting to hit that scale, and those completely change really how you think about access. If we think about short-term funding cycles, so the US releasing, very welcome aid funding, coming in 6-month, 12-month opportunities, though, you look at these access constraints, and how do we as aid organizations apply the tried and tested approaches, condense those into a 6-month cycle to be able to get over these constraints? That's a big challenge that's coming out. So really, I think that what ACAP's report is asking us to do is to think about this shift, a shift from scaling up and down in our efforts around security and access based on the level of constraints, to also starting to think about whether we need to change how we approach those constraints. I think that that's a really key thing I'd like to sort of get into a bit today as we continue this conversation. We're already seeing those conversations start. There's been quite a lot of work recently on what does a modern acceptance-based approach mean for aid organizations. Unsurprisingly, for even just with us, with 150 odd members of all different mandates and sizes, it's very different. But everyone's finding that they're having to re-examine their existing approaches. And also, as I reflect on the nature of the access constraints, think about localization. And as these constraints are getting bigger, there's been a renewed impetus for INGOs and UN agencies to really up their game a bit on localization. So I welcome that. I'm sure everyone welcomes that we're seeing a bit more attention being put onto the duty of care for local organizations, the ones doing the last mile delivery. And I think that's partly because not maybe it's not for the reasons that we would have hoped, but always been an assumption that when access gets bad, national NGOs can fill that gap. But there's an issue now, one being the morality of that, but also that the nature of the impediments and the access constraints can be equally difficult for national NGOs. So we can't just rest on our laurels there. But before we unpack later on, I wanted to just quickly read the opening few lines from a major INGO's organizational security policy. Relief and development organizations no longer enjoy the presupposed protection of the universal, apolitical, neutral delivery of humanitarian relief. Global trends and recent events signal the growing vulnerability of aid organizations. That sounds pretty familiar. You can probably all relate to that. That was written in 1998, 28 years ago. So I just share that to emphasize that as a sector, we do find a way to manage these new challenges. Sometimes they can require tough decisions and self-reflection, but we do find a way. So I'll pass back to you, Abbas.
Thanks, John, and thanks for sharing that quote, which is quite insightful and makes us think about where we are at in how we are tackling these issues that we're discussing today. And this brings me to the first question I wanted to ask you. Maybe I can start with Anthony. You've already touched on this a little, but from your perspective, how is this shift changing the risk perspective and the risk picture for humanitarian organizations and their people? Basically, how these administrative decisions, this criminalization that we're seeing in so many different contexts, how does it affect, and how do you tackle it from a day-to-day basis?
Thanks, Abbas. Yeah, no, I think it's interesting because actually we did a study last year in Iraq, which is actually one of our kind of smaller country programs. And we found that actually in most security incidents that were happening in Iraq in the last year, they'd had a negligible impact in terms of organizations' access. So organizations would go through a security incident, and when we record, as we do for all of the security incidents affecting aid workers, what was the organizational response to that? Most organizations said that they stayed in the area, or they adapted slightly, but they stayed in the area. When we compare that to bureaucratic and administrative impediments, almost 50% of the people that we surveyed indicated that they had suspended operations, suspended activities, or withdrawn from certain areas in Iraq because of the bureaucratic and administrative impediments. So I think it is really changing in terms of how we manage access, because to some extent, and again, building off of what John was saying, we find a way, we've managed physical security risk, particularly in kind of contexts like Iraq for quite a long time, right? Like we've been in Iraq for many years now. There's an understanding about how we manage some of those physical security risks. But I think it's becoming more and more challenging in terms of how we manage some of the day-to-day bureaucracy, and both whether we can feasibly or physically implement programming, like whether we have the permissions to do so, whether we can actually kind of, gain the access that we need or negotiate the access with the state authorities through the legal processes that are imposed on us, and also whether it's principled to do so, whether the compromises that we're forced to make as part of those legal processes are, in line with a way in which we want to principally deliver a response. So I think that is one of the kind of changing parts of this landscape. I think also, again, just to kind of piggybacking off John's earlier intervention, I think what we are seeing in multiple ways is exactly, as he said, a changing way in which we need to build acceptance or even understand the concept of humanitarian acceptance. I think often the traditional way of seeing acceptance from a humanitarian point of view is you have a lot of engagement with the community that you're working with and the beneficiaries that you're directly providing assistance to, and you get the tick when you register every year. And obviously, I think that's changing. There's far more importance in terms of building political acceptance with authorities, and also ensuring that we're engaged with multiple levels of authorities. This is something that we have as INSO, have maybe faced the sharp end of some of this acceptance crisis, and learning from the way in which we've had to manage some of our challenges in different contexts, it's demonstrated that you need to be talking and then building that acceptance through multiple parts and multiple layers of a government institution. You can't just say, okay, well, whichever ministry is responsible for aid has said we're A-OK, and rest on that laurel. You need to have a kind of more political acceptance strategy as well. And then I think one of the key issues within that is also an emerging issue is how do we build acceptance in the digital space as well? Because whilst we see bureaucratic and administrative impediments and increasing detention, overriding that, or kind of like the context in which that's happening in, is a context where aid work is being discredited in an online space that then provides the permissive environment for those detentions and those increasing impediments to be put in place. A third key change that we're kind of addressing is also, we often see bureaucratic and administrative impediments from a very state-focused lens, but I think increasingly what we're seeing is effectively tit for tat imposition of bureaucracy from competing regimes. So we see this from our perspective in places like Sudan, in places like DRC, where basically non-state armed groups with territorial control see what the state is doing and use effectively mechanisms to control or limit the access of aid actors as a means of legitimizing their authority in a certain area of the country. And that creates a massive challenge for aid actors, because effectively by agreeing to compromises on one side, potentially we're setting precedents for further compromises on another. And then with competing access regimes, you end up being stuck between a rock and a hard place. We get a visa from one authority, it means our visa is rejected on the other side of the line. And I think this is adding to that complexity, as bureaucratic and administrative impediments are not just imposed by state actors, but are increasingly also imposed by non-state actors. To not end on so much of a negative, I think there are things that we are kind of seeing or kind of that are emerging as part of to address this. One aspect of this is I think there has been an increased investment by NGOs in administrative access. So many larger NGOs will have liaison officers who are responsible for doing a lot of this administrative follow-up. I do think that we need to kind of reflect a little bit as a sector in terms of the effectiveness of that mechanism, and whether by treating all of these access access and administrative impediments as primarily administrative, we then miss the point that all of this is an access negotiation. Every single new administrative measure that comes in is an access negotiation, and if we treat it like it's just part and parcel of administration, we maybe miss opportunities to really broaden out the space that we're engaging with. And the final point that we're doing, I think all of this for me just reaffirms the need for, stronger collective positioning and to push back on some of these. And I think it's important that a lot of this work, particularly around kind of legal, bureaucratic, and administrative impediments, often falls on kind of NGO fora who have very fragile funding structures and who are basically, having to do a lot of this analysis in terms of the legal frameworks that exist in a country and do a lot of the advocacy on bureaucratic and administrative impediments, but often not necessarily well supported either by donors, by the kind of diplomatic community, or to some extent, even by some of their members. And I think if we are going to kind of open up some of this access, we need to reinvest and kind of really kind of better structure our support to the collective mechanisms that are there to really kind of support us in addressing some of these challenges. Thanks.
Thanks, Anthony, for flagging all these very interesting points. And I think the Iraq example that you provided is quite helpful just to understand how consequential these bureaucratic impediments can be as compared to security-related constraints. The importance of political acceptance through multiple levels of authority, and of course the challenges of these acceptance in the digital space. Definitely, something that probably we will keep discussing for a while in this era. And the challenges around fragmented authorities and all the bureaucratic impediments that it causes to organizations. Many thanks for that, Anthony. I'll pass over to John for your reflections on this question.
Yeah, so thinking about the risk picture for organizations, I think an interesting aspect to be unpacked is what we could be seeing is an increasing diversity in how access constraints impact different organizations. Now, clearly, that's always been the case, that different organizations have different levels of access. But in my gut, I feel like there's the potential for an increase in that spread. Detentions, prosecutions, deregistrations, these are political acts. They're political responses. So let's take a step back really quickly. The traditional foundations of access and security management for aid organizations are acceptance, neutrality, impartiality. If we take neutrality, that worked in the post-Cold War period when, let's be honest, you didn't have to think too hard about what neutrality really meant. You were on the side of universal human rights, the side of the Enlightenment, of Western dominance, of a global narrative that happened to align with Western values, and within which the NGO and aid sector had developed. The idea of neutrality as an enabler of programming and access held because that side essentially ruled the world. But in today's multipolar reality, that illusion has collapsed. In many parts of the world, those organizations, those previous universal principles, they no longer read as neutral. In fact, they read as hostile. Look at the Sahel as a case study. So aid organizations operating under that old model are no longer seen necessarily as impartial actors. They're seen as facilitating outreach by opponents. And Anthony mentioned that necessity for collective approaches to pushing back on those. And you might say, well, isn't that the UN's job? Isn't that OCHA's job in country? The UN is a really clear representation of that old model, of that post-Cold War universal agreement on what these principles are. So to bring it back, these detentions, deregistrations, etc., they can be seen as a rational political response to what are interpreted as political acts. We don't have time to really unpack this hypothesis. I think it needs unpacking, but certainly in terms of the risk picture, it means that increasingly aid organizations, and I don't just mean big INGOs, I mean national NGOs, all levels, are going to have to consider a much wider range of transnational trends, which are going to impact their unique risk profile in particular contexts. One other element that we're increasingly looking at, and which is related to this as well, one thing we're looking at in terms of access is insurance. Doesn't get brought up a lot in this context, but it's important. The availability of appropriate insurance is often overlooked when you're considering the level of access for aid organizations. But increased uncertainty, changes in the world and geopolitics, conflict, this all happening in a number of contexts plays into pricing. And you can be assured that increases to political barriers, like detentions, etc., are being costed in. The insurers are really very aware of this. For a number of NGOs with recent reductions in aid funding, they've lost, that's had a financial impact on them. And so if they cannot get the right insurance to operate in an area, they're less able to self-insure. They're less able to own the risk. In terms of their risk profile, this means they have to make tough decisions. Do they take on that risk? And if so, what does that mean for their duty of care to their staff and their ability to fulfill that duty of care to their staff? Or does the aid organization implement programming, but in a more conservative way, potentially leaving those most in need, but beyond their reach without support? Or, third option, do we see more risk transfer to local organizations for last mile delivery who can get the job done, but at what cost to them and their staff? And how is that national organization's profile being influenced by being associated with that downstream funding and who it's coming from and where it's coming from?
Thanks, John. That's very insightful, and yeah, thanks for bringing up this topic of insurance that we don't see that often when we look at firsthand humanitarian access related sources. So yeah, that's very helpful. I think we've done here a good diagnosis of what the risk landscape looks like. Maybe we can move to our next question, which is more about what organizations and the wider sector can do to protect their staff while also preserving their ability to maintain access. Maybe we can start with you, Anthony. Perhaps just to learn from you if you came across or worked on any practical measures that are being implemented to help organizations navigate these pressures.
Yeah, so I mentioned, and I'll jump the gun a little bit in terms of some of the practical measures that we see organizations already kind of doing to address some of these challenges, liaison officers being one of them, kind of collective negotiations and collective positioning being another. But maybe I just also focus on a couple of other areas where I think, increased engagement could be useful. One, and not to raise another kind of analysis of the problem, but it strikes me that in the numbers that you present in the report around suspensions, often, when we see kind of 350 NGOs suspended or 200 NGOs suspended, very often those are local and national organizations. And I think we do as a collective need to be better at kind of looking at, again, the civil society space as a whole and identifying the warning signs that we're seeing, and also ensuring that we are mounting a principled defense when any part of our system is impacted by these challenges. I think too often what I've seen, and now I'm at INSO, but I used to be the NGO Forum Coordinator in Sudan, and often I do see that we kind of say, okay, well, when we see a national NGO suspended or we see a national NGO blacklisted, as an international humanitarian community, we often say, well, that's not really our problem. And I think we need to start to see it really as our problem, because it's going to come to us as the international community, and it affects our partners, it affects how we deliver assistance. And I think it's, as John said, it's this shift in terms of not seeing localized response as, less at risk than international response, because actually I would argue that, particularly from an administrative point of view, localized response can sometimes be even more vulnerable to some of the risks that this report outlines, and we need to be better at kind of having that collective position. I think another element of this is that actually many of these administrative barriers, the criminalization of aid, also very much targets the kind of structures that enable us to mount collective responses. So here, obviously as INSO, we're particularly affected by this in terms of the misrepresentation of some of our work as kind of politically aligned. But we see it also in terms of the PNGing of humanitarian coordinators, not providing visas to NGO forum coordinators. Again, I think that there needs to be both, not just a financial support to the structures that underpin our collective access, but also a political support, particularly from member states, when we see humanitarian coordinators harassed or PNG'd for taking principled positions. We need to defend those people structurally, because if we don't, what we see is less and less of our leadership willing to take the actions necessary to really continue to hold some of these principled positions. I think a third point is we do need to kind of adapt the way in which we coordinate to ensure that we are, I suppose, ensuring that the decisions that we take around how we manage risk are informed by those who are most exposed to that risk. We see it in a number of contexts. I'm thinking here particularly of Ukraine, where those local organizations who are on the front lines of the Ukraine response, who are caught in the crosshairs of the drones that are continuing to inhibit access and kill aid workers, have for some years been arguing that they needed things like armored vehicles, that they needed kind of more proactive defense or more proactive mitigation measures against this drone threat. And the international community has created a time lag between the request that we receive from local actors in terms of how to mitigate that risk and whether we as an international community believe that that's an appropriate way of mitigating that risk. And I think we need to build structures in our coordination systems that really do defer to those who are most exposed to risks, need to be listened to more within the structures of decision making, so that we can address these issues earlier on. And the final point, I would just like to say that I completely agree with John's kind of hypothesis that we will start to need to have a more differentiated aid sector, and different organizations are going to have to respond to these risks in very different ways. If any of you have read Hugo Slim's kind of like latest book, he kind of make this argument that humanitarian organizations need to start to understand what type of humanitarian they are. And he frames it very much in terms of the climate crisis. But I think for too long, we as humanitarian organizations have almost thought, well, we are a neutral humanitarian organization, but we are going to fund the educational policy of a government. And we don't see that from the perspective of an armed group who's fighting that government, and then says, well, how neutral are you really if you are implementing, a government policy? And I think it's not to say that that is not a neutral thing to do or not a principled thing to do, but I think that we are going to have to start to define ourselves of what type of humanitarian are we? Are we the type of humanitarian that is going to operate primarily in non-state armed group control and adapt our risk posture to that type of environment? Or are we a type of humanitarian that, is going to support state-led systems in a crisis and take appropriate risk mitigation measures to address that specific dynamic. Because I think it's going to become increasingly more and more challenging to basically claim the principles without really doing the legwork of operationalizing them.
Thanks a lot, Anthony, for unpacking the civil society suspension issues, which definitely are the problem of all the organizations, because it tends to broaden the impact and the ability of organizations to reach people in need, and also the need for being more upfront in terms of how organizations react to some decisions. For example, when some NGO members are PNG'd or stuff like that. I'll hand over to John for your reactions on this question.
So what can you do? A big part of GISF's work is this organizational capacity building of NGOs to manage risk. And we often talk about the mainstreaming of risk management. So it's not just the security team's role. It's not just the access team's role, the access person's role. It's got to be a whole of organization approach. And the nature of, especially these political risks and the access impediments, it really calls for a whole of organization approach, particularly from the leadership of your organization, who might say, oh, we just deal in what they might call enterprise risk or risk to the whole organization, not security risk. But it does require their buy-in. So those responsible for security and access need to be doing a whole lot of internal outreach. A key early step of this is to ask the question of your leadership, do you have a risk appetite statement? That sounds like a very technical term, but it's basically just, has a position been agreed within your organization on what level of risk and what circumstances the organization is willing to accept? Because that starts to help to frame the conversation about how do we approach these access impediments, especially ones that are changing rapidly. So these are all evolving, especially political ones. They're going to change, very, very rapidly. And you don't want to have to go back to square one of the conversation each time. You want to have an agreed starting position within your organization on how you approach those. And once those conversations are happening, well, let's think about how our actions and our decisions as an organization are going to influence how we're perceived, which will play a role in how these political risks and legal and administrative barriers are going to play out. That's not a security problem. You can't be in charge of that. You need other people to be aware of that. Who are we taking money from? How will that be perceived? With a reminder that perception, as Anthony was saying, perception trumps objective reality in these situations. It doesn't matter what you think you're doing is neutral. Neutrality is entirely about how you're perceived to be doing things. What is our brand? How is that brand interpreted in different areas where we work? What type of work are we doing? This is not, again, just to really emphasize, this is not the access and security focal points job, but your job is to become an advocate. Whether you're at Save the Children or World Vision, or whether you're from a small organization that only works in one context in one country, you can do this. Because what you do in one country or in one context has the potential to impact your access in other areas. Interestingly, we often talk about mis and disinformation affecting security and access, but there is also a simple and unfortunate aspect, which is that the communication of information, a simple objective, the organization did X over here, and through the wonders of technology, people in another place are now aware, and they don't like that, and it doesn't sit well with them. So you need to be aware of that. It's not just mis and disinformation. It's the fact that what you do in one place can be sent across and reinterpreted somewhere else. So yes, there are lots of approaches that aid organizations can take to mitigate the impact of detentions once they happen, mitigate that impact on their staff and their programming. But I would push that it's equally important to engage in that self-examination as an organization to better understand what factors you can control in advance. There's a really good example of MSF. They're now formally linking their communications and security teams, so they have a better understanding of how what MSF's actions are being perceived, so that there's a formal channel to say to the security team and the access team, be aware of this, so they can respond as an organization. Just one example, I think it's an interesting one. Um, and then in terms of collective approaches, 100% agree. And we had a really interesting discussion in a couple of months ago with Anthony and with a bunch of the NGOs talking about how those collective models can evolve. Another aspect that came out of that conversation was the importance of building out relationships beyond traditional humanitarian actors. So one is to, in your particular context, build those relationships with human rights actors who can help you to mobilize legal assistance and international advocacy, but also even to look at other civil society, religious groups, etc., who are in there and who can build those relationships in advance to help if you need to bring those in at a later point when you're trying to deal with any detentions or administrative impediments. And then finally, slightly on a bigger picture, uh, we're talking about the whole system starting to evolve. And we talk about insurance as being the absence of insurance as being an impediment. And one of the things GISF is working on, for example, with our members is can we take that insurance and make it an enabler of access, not just for INGOs, but for national NGOs, community-based organizations. And we're actively looking at the establishment of a mutual insurance organization, which means that NGOs would be the owners of that insurance company, and it would be really geared towards opening up access and overcoming those kinds of boundaries. So we've got those sort of more those top level collective approaches. INSO have got really good ideas, and I'm quite looking forward to seeing at that real operational, really at the pointy end about how they're starting to adapt and they're bringing out new models. And I think that as long as we can all support those and be open to new ways of working, then there are going to be ways to get around these changes in the environment. Over.
Thanks, John. And yeah, quite interesting. And one point that struck me is that misinformation and disinformation is also becoming a recurring topic in the access landscape. And I was wondering, from your perspective, if we know like how exposed humanitarian organizations are, like from experience, and whether this acceptance in the digital space concerns only like the people in need or just the authority level, like how, yeah, like what level are we talking about when we talk about the acceptance on this in the digital age? Anyone want to come in on that? Yeah, John.
Briefly, but I'm going to set up Anthony to going to give him an easy one to knock out of the park. What he said was you can't, and this is what McDonald's or any company will find on social media, you can't be liked by everyone. So, and that's the same in life in general. And so we're in this period of history where it's a fruitless endeavor to try and appeal to everyone. So you've got to have to, again, reflect on what is your organization setting out to do and what are the key relationships that you need to suspend and how do they fit within your principles. I think that there are other aspects of mis and disinformation, that they serve as they're really adding fuel to the fire around some other developments. We haven't even touched specifically on drones yet, but they are a match made in hell. But I'll pass back to Anthony.
Yeah. So, okay, as somebody who's also responsible in my non-policy and advocacy role, but also for INSO's communications, And if you maybe take INSO as maybe at the more vulnerable end, but indicative of where we are as a sector, we work. There's a guy who has a methodology for this in terms of how vulnerable are we to disinformation, and we worked with him on a couple of sessions. It's called like the flood methodology, and basically the outcome was INSO is underwater in terms of our vulnerability to disinformation. And I think that's probably reflective of if people were really honest in terms of their own vulnerabilities to this. I think that this would be kind of similar across many organizations. It's just that you haven't experienced your disinformation targeting event yet. And I think this is, something that we are going to have to address. And I think one of the things, and it's interesting, John's example of the MSF linking to the comms team and their security team, because one of my reflections is actually, for most NGOs, your communications team will largely have traditionally focused on fundraising and visibility. And we are therefore ill-adapted from just a structural point of view in terms of the strategic communications that we need to be able to address the new information landscape that we're facing. Because it's not actually always, as kind of John outlined, mis and disinformation. Almost, I would argue, mis and disinformation is sometimes the wrong way of framing it, because it often focuses our mind on, is this true or not? Which often is not the point. The point is not somebody saying something that's not true. It's that they have taken a truth and misrepresented it in a certain way to then create a delegitimizing impact on your organization. And so I think that, I think we are incredibly vulnerable to this. The final point I would say is, where we see most vulnerability and where we see actually the most impact of this is states, again. So again, this is why I don't kind of want us to move away from the disinformation framing of this, because often it then focuses on, okay, what are the rumors around Ebola in a certain area? And that has an impact. I'm not kind of trying to dismiss that. But where we see organizations being suspended, it's largely initiated by some sort of state campaign against that organization or against humanitarian aid in general, which is a much more difficult problem to address than just, are we correcting a rumor here, or here, but really trying to say, look, we are under an attack by a state authority and they are using disinformation or kind of malinformation or harmful narratives to undermine our legitimacy in a given context. I think there's a lot that is currently going on. The Insecurity Insight is, pushing a lot on this in this area. For those of you who've read, the Centre of Armed Groups has a very good report on geopolitical fragmentation, where it makes a similar argument that there are resources available on narrative monitoring, etc., but they're just not very accessible, or they're unequally accessible and not really leveraged by humanitarian leadership in country. And I think, creating those systems at the country level to monitor and then address hostile narratives is an area where we're currently very weak as a sector.
Thanks, Anthony and John, for those reflections. I'll then bring the audience in, looking if there are questions on the chat, or if you would like to speak up, you can just unmute yourself and go ahead. As we speak, I see that there's one question on the country selection that we have in the report. I just wanted to mention that actually the 66 countries that we are covering are determined by the existing crises that are active on the Informed Severity Index, which provides a comparative baseline on the severity of crises across countries and across contexts. So whatever number of crises are active on the Informed Severity Index will equal the number of crises that will be assessed on the Humanitarian Access overview. And this is why, for example, in the previous access report, we had over 88 countries, and for this one we had around 66. So that means that some of the criteria that were required for us to keep a crisis active in terms of number of people in need or displacement figures and other indicators were not necessarily met. So we had to close those crises. But just to reflect on the fact that the crises that we consider are those that are documented on the Informed Severity Index, which ACAPS maintains on a monthly basis and publishes on a monthly basis. One question also for the two panelists, and it's a hard one. What is the hardest trade-off between staying and operating and protecting staff from legal exposure? Anyone has any reflections on that?
Security is entirely about trade-offs. Every single decision you make is how do we do something, whether we do it or not, and what's the impact? It's essentially a constant return on impact equation that you're looking at. Some of the real considerations are around, I wouldn't frame it any differently, to be honest, from any other particular risk in terms of the process that you need to go through. The fact of harm there's two things. Harm is going to be could be caused to your staff and everything that comes with that. And the second is, does this affect the ongoing viability or resilience of your organization, the organization's ability to continue doing what it was set up to do in the first place? And then as you dig in, then there are specific ways that plays out versus, is someone going to be injured in a car vehicle accident versus are they going to be detained? Some are going to affect your organizational resilience in different ways, and the impact on that staff member, if it manifests, is going to be different. It might be, it can be different physical impacts, there can be different mental impacts on that staff member. So the trade-offs are always there. I guess the key thing is, if you're an organization that hasn't yet fully understood the nature of those threats, then you might not be able to make a fully informed decision when you're considering those trade-offs. In which case, as Anthony said, and I reiterated, look to partners and peer organizations to help you become better informed. Talk to civil rights activists, talk to rights-based organizations. Inform yourself so you can go through the same process as usual. Over.
And maybe building on that, because I'm also kind of going to answer the question in a way that doesn't directly answer the question of what's the biggest trade-off. But I think there's two aspects of this that are kind of concerning to me. And I think maybe it's helpful if we kind of frame this as less about what's the trade-off in terms of like the legal kind of administrative risk. But what's the trade-off when effectively, I think all we're kind of circling around the general point of this is where humanitarian action itself starts to be seen as a threat to the state actors in the places that we're working in. What are the trade-offs that are involved in managing risk appropriately? And in that, I think there's a number of dilemmas. One is obviously, as I mentioned before, how people experience that risk will be very different, right? So, and the people who are responsible for taking the decision about what risks and how to manage that trade-off are often not going to be the people who are most exposed at the end of the day to that risk by association with a humanitarian organization once being part of a humanitarian organization becomes a risk in itself. And that's a ethical challenge in terms of how do we create the systems necessary to ensure that decisions that we are taking are informed and also inform those who are most exposed to the risks that they face. The second is also something that I mentioned before, which is the longevity of these risks. So these risks are not necessarily time bound to the space where those decisions are taken. And I don't think this is necessarily a new thing, right? I often used to complain when I was in Sudan that, I was having to deal with an access landscape that had been agreed by NGOs 10 years prior to me, right? And was still having to kind of undo things that seemed like a good compromise 10 years ago, but were now a massive impediment to what we were doing. So the longevity of kind of access impediments and access challenges are well understood. I think the challenge is more where legal risks move beyond the kind of the scope of the employment of that staff member, but continue to expose them maybe long after their association with the decision that a single country director or others have taken. And I think that raises the impact of some of these risks, right? And also, again, starts to challenge some of the traditional frameworks of duty of care, which may be very kind of tightly bound within employment frameworks and in terms of like the contract period that people have. And so I think those are two particular concerns I have in terms of the dilemmas that we're currently faced with from some of the risks that we've talked about today.
Thanks a lot, Anthony and John, for those reflections. I think they are quite helpful. And I feel like we could continue this discussion for a while, but in the interest of time, I think I will bring the discussion together with three takeaways as we are closing. I guess first, the fact that humanitarian access is deteriorating in many parts of the world, and with little indication that this trend will reverse in the coming month. Second, as we discussed today, the constraints are increasingly taking forms that are less visible, but then that can be as effective in preventing humanitarian organizations from reaching people in need. And third, this shift is really changing the risk landscape for humanitarian organizations and their staff. And Anthony and John have highlighted how organizations are having to think not only about physical security, but also legal exposure, administrative restrictions, and broader implications of duty of care. And I think all of this makes it even more important that we continue to monitor and document humanitarian access, how it's evolving across the globe, and take shared lessons from across organizations and strengthen collaboration across the sector, both among operational actors and with other organizations working on analysis, security, and coordination. As we mentioned in the beginning, the full global access overview is available on our website at acaps.org, and I'd encourage you to take a look and share any feedback you may have. And finally, a huge thank you to Anthony and John for sharing your insights and contributing to such a rich discussion. I think that will put an end to this session, unless John and Anthony have any final points you would want to raise. Okay, then with that, thanks everyone, and see you in the next event. Bye.
Thanks, Abbas.